All right, I will share. Okay, but let's agree on on the agenda, and
On agenda,
then
yeah. Okay,
then
so oh god, yeah.
yeah, in general, I'm interested in discussing the third point, which I think kind of is a variation of um, the first 2 points, where there seemed to be a theme of discussion on the Discord about um, the Zettelkasten seems like it's useful, but there are some modifications that people are making, and so I'm very interested in that. Like, what does it look like to? Because there's like sort of there's a 4-level translation that's happened, right? So we got Lumen to Sonke, and then Sonke to Bo, and then Bo to Y'all, and there's been like interesting changes along the way, and in some ways, going from Sonke to from Lumen to Sonke was generalizing, right? It was taking it out of the particular kind of social theory context that Lumen was interested in to like more general. I think Sonke's audience was including just like regular students who aren't interested in doing research, and then it moved to kind of personal writing as the general context. How would you describe the use cases that RBC covers?
It's
So
like a
I say
cousin. Yeah, it's like
no,
a
you go.
cousin. It's like a cousin to journaling. That's what I feel.
It's very broad, so I don't know that I have a good sense of like what the use case is, but
I'd say personal interest, because if it's like it's very personally
very
driven.
personal. Yeah.
Is not only in the interest but in what you choose to take from the text,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
that personal approach is not as concerned as as a few selected group of people might be with tracing back where all of the information comes from.
Yeah.
So it's almost like it's almost like a synthesis is happening between what the text is happening and what I remember from anything else that's happened to me in my life.
Yeah.
What I heard.
Yeah. I think a variation of that is what we should be doing as researchers all the time anyway, right? We're approaching like a finding or a theory or something that someone's saying and connecting it to what else we know. But it seems like the Bo's approach goes like a lot more into the personal history. When I talked to him, he kept harping on the idea of resonance. Like, what does this mean to you? And I think that makes sense in many circumstances, but it didn't quite make sense for me. Like, he was like, we were looking at this like snippet of a result, and he was like, what does this mean to you? I'm like, I'm not sure, because it's not that kind of thing.
It's necessary to understand that Bo is self-taught.
Bo is self-taught. Yeah.
Because of that, it is his interpretation of Sonke, and Sonke has come up with his own version of Zettelkasten, which is very different from the German guys what they're doing.
Yeah. I think there's that. There's the 4-level translation in the Rome line, and then there's the branch off from Lumen into the Zettelkasten forum line.
Yes.
And from there you also have like different software. But anyway, so back to so Lumen was social theory, right? Sonke is general audience, but still academic. Bo is general audience, personal, and now we're trying to bring it back to our setting, which is how we would describe it.
Repeatable and verifiable knowledge work.
Right. Yeah. So like we're interested. I'm interested. The way I would describe what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to generate new knowledge that's valuable. much larger audience than myself, right? Like to me, the way I understand research is we're pushing the boundaries of what humanity knows, right? Or at least your field, or people who care about your problem. But it's beyond like, in creativity research, we have like little c versus big C creativity. Like little c is like new to you, like amazing, I've learned something new. But maybe like 500 people have like come out with this insight before, and so it's great that it's for you, but it doesn't really help anybody else. But the goal of like research to me is pushing the boundaries of what everybody knows. And so I think the bar feels higher to me. Like it kind of goes back to, I think, Peter, you're getting at this idea of like needing to have verifiable traces and having a bit more of the structure to it. Okay, so right, so there's that four-level translation. Yeah, so I think I branched off from Sonke, because Sonke was my first introduction to Zettelkasten, and I attempted a implementation of Zettelkasten that was similar to this, like you've got the sequences and the numbers and all that kind of stuff, and it didn't stick for me. So that's my branch. That's why I'm interested in comparing like my branch with Peter, what you have, because you're forking off of RBC, right?
No, I use both because I'm trying to do some creative writing, and for personal interest, I am very like I have my reasons and specific cases in which I want to use the one that uses the more creative part, because it's not
Le Beau Zettel.
Is Le Beau Zettel. While in other cases, my PhD, I want to have repeatable and verifiable information. And there's something in between, because sometimes there's personal reading that I just really enjoy, and it's like, this is a really interesting topic.
Yeah.
But because, it's like when you go through your PhD, eventually you're just surrounded by PhDs. So everyone is like very critical. And whenever you say like, oh, did you know that this happens? So there's like, what did you read that? It's like, I read in this book. Yeah, but did you double check? Because I'm surrounded by people like that, I just ended up having, like, for certain arguments that I really care, just having that kind of attitude and just always looking and like double checking everything. But because it's like there's so much of information that now is even more important.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So
can I ask, out of curiosity, Joe?
Yeah, go ahead.
When you were creating your branch, did you in the beginning have in mind that this was something you wanted to implement collaboratively, like with your students already at that, like when you were already designing it, or it sort of happened?
No, I think so. I came to Zettelkasten from thinking about the general problem of synthesis, and there was that history of the problem has a very strong failure mode of like wanting everybody to be in the same graph, like everybody contributing to a shared general knowledge graph, which has always failed for a bunch of reasons. One is that you need a space for yourself. Two, a lot of knowledge is contextual, and so if you have a graph that's universal, then things get lost in that giant thing. And third,
you're all reading the same source material and interpreting it differently.
Yeah, and the third thing is like if you it's the value proposition of contributing to a giant like world scale knowledge graph is not as compelling as contributing to your own personal knowledge base and potentially your collaborators. Those are some of the like three reasons that I think it's failed, at least in the scientist case. You're not going to get researchers to do that.
Show everybody else what they're working on.
I think there is an additional point. It's like, which is kind of like the problem with research to some extent. Is like a need for property. It's like we obviously, like, your career is based on how much you produce, so you have to prove that you made it. And I'm having such a big information base collaboratively, it removes also that sense of poverty because it spreads it out through everyone. So it's harder to say like how much work you actually done, and because the system needs that at the moment, it's harder to incentivize people to have that kind of contribution.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. In general, the vision that Rome has of this, like, even the federated, like, idea of multiplayer drafts is still at odds with in general how academia functions. Of, like, we want to publish papers as the main thing. We want to publish lots of papers. We want to publish papers that we can trace back to myself, so we can get evaluated and get our beans counted and so on. Which you can tell from the way I'm saying it, I don't like it. But yeah, so Michael, from the beginning, I was thinking of it as mostly probably going to be each person has their own graph, and then figuring out how to stitch graphs together. Interface between graphs is the idea, and in some cases you can have a shared graph. So if there's enough shared context, like me and my group, I think it kind of works because we meet every so often, very regularly, and we have shared problems. We read the same things, and so it works. But I think going beyond that to like a larger group, I think starts to get into the failure mode.
Got it. And just by the way, out of curiosity, that smaller group, do they also all have their own, or they pretty much work in that? Okay.
It's a process. So I mean, this whole thing is like weird, right? Like, I don't know what your experience is with your colleagues, but the idea of having a hypertext notebook is weird, and then the idea of using Rome is even weirder. So right now they're basically writing in my notebook is how it kind of feels. And that's fine. So I don't require them to use Rome for themselves. I don't require them to write their journals or their research notes in Rome. But if we're going to have a shared artifact, like we're doing collaborative lit reviews, I ask them to write evidence notes and claim notes in the shared graph, so we can have it together, and that works okay.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Peter, can you show what you have, and then
my graph is would you mind allowing me to share? Yeah,
of course. Here.
Thank you. So this is my today. So this is an example of what I mentioned into a thread a few weeks ago. Let's zoom in. The structure I was thinking for bringing things together is to have is similar to what Bo has, which is something along the line of
the parent block is relevant notes, and then right below that is the space for the notes, the permanent notes to intermingle, right? And then underneath permanent note is the genesis of that particular permanent note, correct?
Yeah, so it's like this is the permanent note as Le Beau Zettel. Well, this one is what I'm trying to do in for PhD material. And I feel like the important things, for example, and then what these notes are here are all referred to my index, which is everything. As long as that page doesn't get too big, everything goes into my permanent notes page, which is this one, which is going to be a mix of. It's a mix of notes that I either created from books and I never zoom in. It's always a little bit of a mess. So these are all the notes, and whenever I want to reference something, all I do is I just drag in whether I want to make it whether I want to make it relevant or want to make it an argument notes. It's just a different degree of connection.
Oh, okay. So loose associative connections go on top, and then specific connections go underneath.
Yeah, so the specific arguments. Okay, so then the notes at the bottom. So for example, in this case, the example I was trying to make here is like, let's say I read something and I made a permanent note in Le Zettel approach. And what happens then is like, let's say that later on I think like, I actually want to find more resources regarding this. I got an example here, which is, for example, I was reading something from this book about language, culture shaping language.
Yep.
And here it's exactly in permanent note, knowledge, language. This is like in my tree. I'm looking for culture shaping language. This one. So if I were to open example this note here and look at what's underneath, this is when I make the note.
Yep.
And this is the great thing about the structure is like I can just see everything. I can see the book I got it out from, what extract was from. Sometimes there's multiple sections from the same book, the interpretation of the book, and everything I was thinking when I was writing that. It was like just lots of personal things and memory from childhood. Like it's more like because now I'm pretty much bilingual. It's just like, certain things in English, certain things like I changed my personality. And I remember there was a paper, I just put myself a to-do to find a paper about personality and things like that. So that drove my research. It was driven by that. And then I looked and it's like what it was supported by was still supported by the literature notes from that part of the book, because it's still like, that was from the book. That didn't have any of my personal contribution to it. And then I started looking for other books. So I started reading this book here, which is called, I think it's Through the Language Glass. Yes.
I see.
I started and I made an observation note. Which an observation note is, so I started creating classification. Next observation note in this case is, I'm just going to zoom here. It's just going to be a travel. It's going to be a journey through all the stuff here. So here is another kind of note that's got exactly the same structure as the permanent notes. At the bottom is exactly the same. So we got the reference from this book.
And it goes in your index, right?
Yeah, and it goes in the same index. And because I use like a slightly different namespace, I can immediately tell, this looks like an observation note. These are all permanent notes. And I can tell the difference. And for example, I put a tree, like the little plant for synthesis one. And this is all from the book. And I also put like some in my fleeting notes. I didn't have many fleeting notes of that because it was driven by something else. But like I put some to-dos, something to do in the future. If I keep on looking into that. And I can see, because I can see where these notes have been considered relevant to the observation, and I can jump to them. So because it's the same structure, the traversal is very similar. So if I were to jump to the block, for example, now we are back into the permanent notes page, and here are all my notes again. So you can see there is some observation notes about normalization, propaganda. And then there is cases in which, for example, so this is one of my literature review I'm doing, because I'm working on refactoring, and these are all papers. So these are mostly all observation. So the difference between observation and evidence is, for me, already unknowingly, there is lots of authors in engineering, in engineering design, the field I am, that sometimes they say things that are known to be true, and every author is still expected to reference those sources, even though they're not necessarily talking about an experiment they run to prove that was true. So that's an observation for me.
Wait, hang on. So observations are like almost like axioms. Like we know.
It's not axiom. It's like I consider an observation weaker than evidence. It's like an observation is, this author said this in a paper. And
interesting.
I know that if I reference this paper when I'm talking about this, it's gonna be fine from like in my field. And it's hard.
I
It
got
goes
you.
through.
I got you.
And then I got these things because it's like I have this observation here from this book, which is like it's one of the main books on the subject. And then I go like I started looking into experiments or studies that were run, and I found like all these different papers. From the same few authors that started doing things like, oh, we looked at these variables and this we looked at different code bases and noticed that there was an increase in error, decrease in error. So like looking at this different variable, and then I can use this. And I found this more valuable because it's like, someone actually went and looked and did something. And what was sad about these papers, I listed one, I think one of these is that the paper actually was claiming the opposite than what I ended up writing, because I looked at the data, it's kind of like your data says something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that goes again down the rabbit hole of personal interpretation.
Yeah.
But this one's like, this page is like if it was just a branch on a permanent page. It's like, because I felt like, this is going to be quite big when I started a couple of months ago, I just put it in this page here. And then I feel like, and it's like when I look at this, I can see, because I keep a little tag next to the relevant node, I can see, these are all permanent. This is synthesis. This is another observation that is related to this one. If I want to see this one, and these are all, so this is how I traverse it. So see if I start from, what was the start? Tests are only essential, are an essential aspect of refactoring, as they ensure that the behavior does not change, blah, 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 blah. So I'm looking for testing, refactoring, finding bugs, and I found this. Refactoring helps to find bugs by routinely clarifying program structure and concurrently reevaluating the assumption made while writing. Throughout the process, the developer has to address the parts of the software that do not work. Or I can go to this one, which is refactoring causing bugs, and there was this is wrong. Yeah, so this should be an evidence.
Yeah.
Cool. Evidence nodes and just change this line. So it's just this study basically was looking at different commits and what the awareness of bugs. And there is, so that's how, so when to go back to today.
Okay, hang on. So I've got a question of the, can you go back to that, where you were?
Here.
Yeah, okay. So observations are kind of like literature notes, in the sense that this is something that someone said.
So this is someone said, but I'm just gonna make a small parenthesis here. On the last RBC call, Sonke came, and when he described this process, something that I inferred from his words, so I'm not sure whether that's actually what he said or is like I misunderstood it. It seemed like he writes his permanent notes straight from his literature notes. As like, or sometimes he just write his name straight from the text, which is what I initially thought reading the book is like, if you want to do research work, it's mostly written straight from the, almost straight from the literature. You look and it's like, this is what the data is saying to me, and this is what the author is saying, and then you can use that block straight into your paper. So that's why it's like the first time I read the book, that's why I was struggling to deal in terms of what is the difference between literature and a permanent note. And it's almost like literature notes is like just you writing notes as you read the book, and then permanent note in the terms of like reusable scientific work is just like, okay, now let's bring everything together. But it still is, it's like you didn't run the experiment. You cannot say that. It's like, this is what I think about it. It's like, as I did, it's like you can look at the data they're showing you and be like, actually, because I had a look as a bigger scope of experiments, I can tell you like you could also interpret this data in this way for these motivations. So I'm going to write this as a permanent note, and it might differ from what they're saying in their conclusions. But it's like they're very similar to literature notes. To be honest, it's like if I open any of them, It's like the literature notes is just like a
Is
shorter version.
right?
It's
yeah.
like it's
Well,
almost
a
like
longer-
one.
A longer version, right? Because it's indented underneath is the whole thing, right?
Yeah. It is, and
Yeah.
then it's like it's condensed, and then it's also brought in a way that I can look at it
Yeah.
independent from the material, because I feel like in order
Yeah.
to understand this, I need to look all of it and then check the name of the paper and the reference and be like, okay, everything works together. Otherwise,
So-
if I just
So another way that I can make sense of it is that the O's and the E's are other people in your community talking inside your Zettelkasten. In the sense that the E's always have a citation in them, right? This particular
Yeah.
person ran this experiment, saw this, and then here your O's seem to sometimes have a citation, but sometimes not. But the way you
Yeah,
described it
some-
was like your O's are the weaker version of E's, where you would cite that in a paper. You would say, this is something we know, citation, and then people would say, that's fine.
when I had to split them, observation, so the O is just like when someone makes an observation without without giving me further evidence
Okay.
to believe his citation, and I
But
got
someone
like,
else,
okay,
though.
yeah, and it's like, okay, this makes sense, but it's like in this 4, 5, 20 pages, you're not given like you're not
Okay,
talking
I got
about
you.
experiments.
Yeah, I got
It's
you.
like
Yeah.
it's like because some material is like it's between textbook or not, and sometimes you just find people.
Okay.
It's just a literature reviews is, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then the evidence is like, then starting maybe from that observation, I started looking like, okay, has anyone actually ever checked and run a study on whether this works or not? And it's just like stemming from it.
Yeah.
And eventually, I think like it's fine to have this one, but eventually for something that I need more of these EV evidence nodes, I'm probably gonna have a higher connection, or they're gonna be connected to more valuable stuff.
Yeah.
Also, what was it? No, this is because it's zoomed in a little better. It's like that. That would be the case. There was a last
if you
thing.
start questioning the truth of an observation note, you would turn it into an evidence note.
You would make evidence notes, right, to respond to it.
If I start questioning the nature of if observation makes me ask a question, I'll make a question note, which is the same structure, the synthesis, but I just ask a question. And then what I'm gonna do is like once this one is once I answer this, I'm just gonna turn it into a synthesis.
Interesting. Okay, so synthesis kicks in when you want to how do I say this? Develop, deepen, test. Unpack. Poke at it.
What? Well, are we talking about synthesis or question?
Sorry, synthesis. But if that's a digression, we can.
No. So synthesis comes in when I want to bring together. I want to. Yeah, when I want to synthesize, when I want to bring together multiple point of views, multiple studies to make a statement about something that was not singularly.
Multiple studies.
Multiple studies, multiple sources is when I want to make a statement that was not. It's not possible to make singularly.
Got it.
A single source, but you need to bring together multiple evidences to get to a conclusion.
Yeah.
Is when I want to make an argument. That's why I call it argument notes. And then I'm just going to have lots of like things that support this. And sometimes you might have anything that opposes it might not necessarily be something that tells you like, okay, this doesn't work. Might end up with that in that direction, but it might also just limit the scope of your statement.
Got it.
Because it's like, or what was it? I don't know. It's just like, if you draw 3 straight line, you can make a triangle. It works as long as your geometry is a piece of paper. In the moment, like you're on a globe, it doesn't work anymore. It's like now straight lines. So like it's just limiting the scope of your statement. And that's
Yeah.
how but before, if in a moment I read something and I say like, oh, this is an interesting question, but I'm not going to work immediately. That was my take on your white paper. Like I just make a question, and then I just leave it around, and like I have a page for questions, and I'll just go through them, or like I'll just search for all the questions in my graph and have them. It's like my research questions are technically not question notes at the moment, but it should be questions. Like I go for research questions from my PhD, and I can probably like.
So a quick question: when you have under synthesis, you have two headings. You have arguments and fleetings. How do you differentiate between those? Is a fleeting just like a wild idea that you have, and then you try to see if you can support it later, or how do you differentiate between those categories?
So fleeting, as of the book, was just
under synthesis. I mean,
yeah. So under synthesis, the fleeting is anything that comes to mind as I am writing my
it's your
composing my argument. It's all my thoughts. It could be like
So it's like a synthesis note. It's a fetal synthesis note. As an argument note, as it were. In other words, it's in its infancy. You still have to determine whether it can be supported, whether it makes sense. It's just
Did you say fetal, Victor?
Yeah, fetal.
That's awesome.
You know,
it could be where I start drafting my final note. It could be where I write anything that I think is like even it's like, I don't know if you ever had that moment in which it's like, oh, this paper from this author that I cannot remember the name. It's like I just write it there and just put it as a to-do. It's kind of like, oh, I can. It's like anything that is regarding this, almost like this project. That is necessary. I just put it in there. Anything that comes to mind. Well, like in terms of arguments and things, so like evidence from different paper and observation from other authors that can help me make my argument. Those are already written, so I just put them in there, straight into the argument notes. And it's like I was looking at what you was I was re-looking at your video, your Loom, the other day, Joel, about the fact that your connection were more contextualized in terms of like how you were structuring your argument. And if I were to write, I mean, I can write my argument here. And while I write it, I can block reference that section there, not the original one, because otherwise it will show into the main graph. And I can start. And you can start like, and that will say like, oh, that's the note that is in that. So in this here, it can just get longer, like considerably longer. And like you can write your thought process. It's still part of the argument. This is the reason why I have this at the top under that and structured this way is because when I jump to this block now, this example block here, what was it? This was an all example. Yeah, this were at the bottom. So it's like this was an example I made just to make the post. It's like when I look at them now, that's where my current structure is. But if they were in the proper place, all of this daily log, my interstitial journaling and the presentation stuff, it wouldn't be in the way. I would literally just have date, the current time, and the type of connection he has to another note.
Type of connection,
yeah. So it's like you can see the connection between nodes, but also you can see that they drive something. If I were to move this node, for example, as a connection to this one here, I'm gonna how to do it now. That inspiration, that inspiration would be also there. So I would also have relevant nodes, language shaping words, etc. So in the same format as before, I would have my note there, and then I would have this one with just driven by added to it. So I can have like the context connection for my argument, and then the contextual connection, or even contextual if I wanted. It's like the only thing I need to add is when I add a relevant note here, I can just write random. What?
Miscellaneous association.
When you run out of words, but like now it's like there. It's like, oh, context. Which is like, this was like the thing I was like, I had a lot of conversation with Mike about this, and in the end it was like, oh yeah, if you just add a word there you go. You want your contextual connections, add your context. It's like, it's one more step. It's like, do you need it? Yes, then put it. You don't need it, don't put it, because it's just like, this is more work.
Yeah. You don't need to force it.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's like, there was one last thing. I think like, is this a thing I told to Bo and the others, was like, I feel like there is, this is a system. It's got lots of steps and lots of connections, right?
Yeah.
And why I asked the questions about what it is because it might need certain properties. But then the way, once you know the properties, the way people structure different things, I couldn't care less. It's like, as long as it works, as long as it works for
well,
you.
Yeah. As an ACI person, I quibble with that.
But the issue, the thing is like, it's not an absolute solution. It's an optimization problem. What are you optimizing for? So like, there's people that want to optimize for serendipitous discovery. So the contextual connection that's supported by, that's not necessary for them. Actually, it could limit them in certain cases. So maybe don't add that. It's also one more step. So it's like, both found like a really, really nice thread line, in which is like, everything is brought to a level in which you got limited friction. I'm just going to stop this. You got limited friction when you try to, you got limited friction when you try to input, very limited friction when you try to take things out. And navigation is very easy. That is like, okay, I like that. It's like, that is the, but then you can also have things in which the navigation, the input is considerably harder, but you are sacrificing the input in order to give even more value to your extraction or your navigation, because you want to search for things. But then that is also like, that is a different use, because it's like, it's not navigation through the connections, but it's like, I know what I'm looking for, or I know what kind of limitation of what I'm put through the nodes I'm looking for. It's a case by case solution.
That's a good way to frame it. I think you have the base structure, and then I can think of it like a machine learning thing. You have pre-training, and then you you do transfer into a particular domain. So there's the optimization for a particular setting or whatever you're optimizing.
I never thought it that way. That's a cool way to look at it.
It's the same thing that you're saying. It's saying like, it becomes an optimization problem when you think about the workflow and the implementation and the details of how it's structured. But if you have the same base elements and the same base relationships between the elements and the same base affordances, then it's fine, like, as long as it works for you. Like, and so defining the optimization criteria is essential, right?
It's like, what do I want out of this? But the thing is like, this is possible because it's a modular structure.
It's modular,
that you reuse. And if you know, if I spend the next month making 10 notes in a format that fails me, it's only those 10 units that fail. Everything else is built in the way it was. So because of that, because of the atomicity and the modularity of it, you can keep on experimenting and changing slightly your direction without sacrificing everything you've done, because everything you've done was based on your prior decisions. So what you can do is like, if you find something considerably better, then you might have a little bit of work in terms of like updating. But as long as you go certain properties and certain aspect of your structure, maybe not of your philosophy, of your style, of how you make the node, then you can keep on updating without losing the work, without losing any of the stuff you are putting.
And see, I'd be so curious, like, to do an experiment, Peter, and sort of tell you, okay, I have, 3 hours and I'm giving you a new research assistant that's going to help you, if you will, distill the structure to its simplest pieces. Because like what you have is very rich and works for you, but for either somebody new to it or somebody that they are more like, that superimposed structure doesn't work so well for them, but you want the key pieces to say, what is the structure of your arguments, of how you interact with you know, with other sources and your own sources and pull ideas together, like distill it down to its most key components, which is what you would need for more collaborative type endeavor.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. So like I have a very strong pull towards simplification for that reason. Yeah.
So what if I was a collaborative in which the note is made before coming to an agreement, my thought was already to have, instead of, you know how I create different notes like or/ev/ and they were like permanent notes. It's just like your name notes, your initial / that's it. Because that way everyone can see that you wrote the note, you can see your ownership of the note, and you can go through them. And then once you get a hang of that, and you know like what goes in the fleeting note is your fleeting thoughts about anything. What is goes in the literature note, you got the description of literature note, goes in the reference, you give them the description was that. That's like what is in the books. Like that is the material that you use to make that claim, so people can quickly see it. And that's the Steiner statement. And that is the statement that if I were to take the statement out of everything, I can understand everything I need to understand that you need to tell me. Who said it, where he said it, why he said it, what kind of experiment they ran. If you don't want to tell me the kind of methodology because it's irrelevant, you don't say it. So like, it's your call. And I can just leave them playing with that because I assume that I also know the kind of person. I was thinking more in a lab setting. It's like, I know that the person has gone through a training or has done a PhD or has done a master, or they are going through a training because they're doing a PhD. And you know that they are going to follow the structure, and that structure is going to evolve. But because like what I said earlier of the modularity and atomicity of the system, that has that evolves, it's fine because everything is just compartmentalized. And it does not necessarily, I don't think they're going to make 200 notes a day. And I don't think they're going to pollute the system that quickly.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to notice if anything just doesn't work. So I think like that is fine. And then if they realize, and then once they get a hang of that, you can tell them now, it's like, okay, I made different kind of notes. So I personally can see the difference immediately with my eye, I can immediately see like, oh, this is this kind of material. This is this kind of material.
I mean, I should be clear. I'm asking this in the context of the lab because that's the easiest way to like grab onto it. What I'm really curious about is the collaborative sense making, if you will, as a research idea, as a concept. So
Hey, Michael, we should work on this idea.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that strikes me is that that the definitions that I don't know if you're Dr. Rosso yet. The definitions that he's using for different types of notes are subtly different from the definitions that I use, and I suspect this is a very common situation. If you're looking towards standardization, having very clear lines of what different words mean is going to be extremely important. In other words, like these are going to have to be, because right now these are all personal systems, and I've actually like been able to extract some really useful ideas from Peter, especially kind of the differentiating or kind of a taxonomy of, for example, observation notes, which I thought was really interesting. But that taxonomy for collaboration is going to have to be very clear and standardized, and kind of differentiating the different types of thoughts. I think, although I tend to go towards simplicity as well, it is important, to Peter's kind of thrust, it is important to kind of differentiate finely the types of thoughts that things are. In other words, is this just something, for example, in anesthesiology, you have the idea that you don't feed patients before surgery. You have to keep them, without being fed. That is just something that started, and it's a legacy thing. There was no evidence for it. They just said it sounds like a really good idea. You probably don't want to do that, so there is no evidence for it. So the more evidence that's been coming out, we've been fighting away. We've been fighting more and more towards we've been moving more and more away from it as more and more evidence comes by. So we say, hey, they actually have nausea, etc. So understanding and differentiating between those types of ideas, I think, is going to be very useful. And so having specific kind of categories for like experimental data versus opinions from experts versus like or accepted opinions from experts, was what I should say, versus
Yeah.
things that are those kinds of. I think having that taxonomy is ultimately going to be crucial for collaboration. I can decide what I want to call it, but if you're trying to set up a system that everybody kind of refer to, they are going to have to make those distinctions. And furthermore, there's going to have to be some sort of group sourced validation of different things. Somebody might think that something is just an old wives' tale that's kind of been passed down, but there may actually be evidence for it that the person that wrote that is not aware of. So those are my thoughts relating to those ideas. So I think that simplicity is very important. We have to clarify the taxonomy, and there has to be some sort of group sourced validation of topics as they go in.
Yeah, I think so
A glossary of thought.
Oh, go ahead.
You need a glossary, a group glossary.
Yeah.
Which is what I keep saying. Like, before we get into all these things, you have to have a really structured set of words that everybody is using with the same meanings. That is a problem with our Zettelkasten issue also, because all of us call Zettelkasten something else in our heads.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is the extreme end of it is what the W3C does, right? They do standards work, right? They say, we've got this working group, and what we're going to try to do is we're going to say, these are the things, this is what we're going to call them, here's a standard, and people can refer to it with a rationale, and there's like community input. There's a whole process for developing standards that I think could be something that if there's enough interest in, we would love to have a shared protocol, shared conventions. Let's do something like this. This is like super heavy, but the underlying idea of a standard specification as an artifact, as an output, I think is
we should do that.
Anyway,
there was just a last thing for collaboration that might be interesting. I remember it came up talking with Mike. I'm going to show again quickly. So one last modification that I thought would be interesting was like, okay, let's say that we're making this in a group. Everyone is putting their notes, and we are trying to come up with an agreement of something
in the same graph.
In the same graph, So like we're following the same structure. That's my assumption. So the only thing I would add here is just under that note. It's I forgot what they're called. The slider. Yeah, the slider. The slider. And you know how it is and then you just go like, oh, actually, I think this is really good. And then someone else might go like, oh, I actually think this is crap. I don't like it. And then you just like, what's the name of the program that does this? Kialo? Something like that?
Kialo, yeah.
Yeah, it's like Mike recommended to me to have a look at it. And it's kind of like you just build up argument maps, and then you just like people give their opinion on each individual piece of evidence or observation. And
this voting mechanic makes me so nervous because there's no way to specify a rationale for a given vote. Like I don't know how to think about the value of the number without understanding on a vote per vote basis. Why did you give it a 6? Why did you give it a 2?
Well, what is?
And also like, who's doing it? And also who's giving the 2?
Who's giving
you can see that.
No, but what I'm saying is that when I say who, I don't mean the who as like I mean like if it's a Nobel laureate in economics, versus me, the idea that their assessment of the value of somebody's argument is going to be different if it has to do with the International Monetary Fund,
or if a Nobel laureate that's drunk.
Correct. But that's a separate issue. That's like, but I'm just saying, like the person who's making this assessment is going. It's just as important. In other words, I mean, we've all seen over the last couple of years, like knowledge is not a democracy. There is truth, sometimes, and there are facts. So understanding that subtle difference. One more point in terms of collaboration, which is also up to Peter's points from earlier, because I might have to jump off in a second. Is that about optimization of purpose? Some people use this kind of structure not only to the way that we might as academics trying to get through a very specific question answer, they'll use it as kind of to generate ideas, you know, a la Tiago Forte, the idea generator, kind of linking ideas randomly. And understanding how that structure works into both of those paradigms is something to consider as well. If this is to be something that can be more universal, because there are people that might be kind of leaning more towards the creative kind of thoughts, and having an idea of how that works kind of more specifically or more explicitly, at least an idea of how it might work explicitly, even if somebody might use it differently, might be useful when this is happening to kind of gain a little bit more universality in terms of allow for more different types of application for this structure. Those are just my thoughts, and
Yeah,
very
yeah.
impressed, Peter. It's a really deep thoughts, and I appreciate it.
Peter, there's a question for you from Husna. How do you pronounce Husna? Can you show your question notes? Wondering if you index questions as well.
So do you want to see question in my index? I keep 1 second. I think the only 3 question notes I have might be on the private part of the graph. It's like, oh, industry.
Yeah, awesome. Okay.
It's lovely to be in a no, but I all I do is just let's
the RBC way would be to put the question note in the index, right? That's what
yeah
came up with.
Yeah, that's what I would do.
That's what I would do too.
It almost seems like it's a luxury, Joel, to have it sort of the way you do, where questions are linked to specific projects or research areas, and that works really well in academia. And maybe for Bo, it just didn't make as much sense. But I also wonder, like, as I'm reading through Peter's stuff, and every time you interact with material, it becomes a question note. So then question notes are just going to be endless, you know, based on any question you ever had when you read, and what makes it into an index as a whole.
So I want to bookmark that as a discussion development item as well. Like, that's an open problem for me. Matt Brockwell has a lot of thoughts on, I think they talk about it in RBC too, like some questions are worth more than others and are worth encapsulating into a driving question. And I agree, right? So there's like questions that come up as you're reading, as you're thinking, they're valuable, but they have a value of like sparking things. But if you want something that's driving, right, inquiry, and you're using that as a collection space, as an index potentially, then it has to take a certain, I think maybe in the early stages of inquiry, you don't have them, and that's fine. Or maybe you have like a vague general question, like, how does teamwork work, or something like that. And that's fine. Like, so that's early stages. And then as you progress down the field, you develop more big questions. But they have to be, I think my instinct is they have to be big, like fundamental questions in some area of inquiry to be page level, if it makes sense.
I have different tags for questions.
Yeah.
So for example, whenever
block level tags, you mean?
Yeah, no, so say that they go in the block. So it's like I got a question note in which I put like a more fledged question. But when I'm like articulating also somewhere inside the structure, there is hashtag RQ research question. Because it's like, I don't know what I want to do when I finish my PhD, but if I want to stay in the same field, this would be a really cool question to explore. And I'm sure my supervisor will be interested in looking at something like this. Or maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. It's worth like writing that down. But then I got hashtag Q. That's a fleeting question. Like, I don't know. It's like, why is this character doing this in this book? Because it's or like, why does this kind of software works this way? Is it better to use Roam or Obsidian? It's like, I don't. It's like maybe I just write a question quickly and I leave it there, and then I hide it from my view so I don't get distracted from it. But then I know that at the end of the day, I can look at all the questions I asked in different contexts and then decide what to do with them. At the end of the week, I can do the same. Or at any point, I can use the serendipity or whatever tool to pick random questions and bring them in and look like, oh, do I still need to ask this question? Do I still care? Delete it or try to answer it in that moment.
Yeah.
So like I feel like I have fleeting questions, and then I got questions that are like I'm very important for me, and then
Capital
I
Q
put it
question. Yeah.
capital Q question, and I put them
Matt calls
elsewhere.
them Zettel questions. He calls them Zettel questions.
Ah,
Yeah. I want to show, I think there's some really nice overlaps, Peter, between what we're doing, but also some contrast. So I'm gonna start sharing. Let's hope it doesn't choke. You see?
oh yes.
Yeah. So this is my model right now. Is that visible? Let me see, maybe I'll zoom in here. So right now, Victor, this is from you.
What is?
This one. So
Oh, yes.
yeah, so the idea is we have sources, and there's like stuff in the sources, and sources can give us two things. They can give us evidence, or they can give us claims. But I don't want to take them at face value, so I firewall them off as like proto claims. I think those are similar, Peter, to your observation notes.
Yeah.
Right? They're coming from a source, but they're not mine. This is mine. So on the basis of evidence and or proto claims from others, the proto claims suggest possible claims, but I'm trying to try as much as possible to build them from evidence. And then there's this loop here, right? So this can be fractally complex, right? Claims can compose themselves into more complex things. And these inform or generate questions. The questions are like the driving force. So previously this was called synthesis node. This was called observation node. I think that's confusing. Claims and evidence, I think, make a lot of sense to me now. As a basic distinction between kinds of things, right? So claims are like knowledge claims about the world. They're generalizable. They're like, spaced repetition improves memory performance, right? They're like generalized over classes of things, and they can be supported or opposed. Evidence is things that are very specific, very contextualized, right? Just like Peter, you have, right? These people did this specific thing and they saw this. And those aren't supported or opposed, they're generated and they can be reproduced. So they're not necessarily, the rhetorical relationships are different, right? So then they can support or oppose claims. So this is a basic ontology right now. This is the latest edition because I needed an escape valve for this source is saying something interesting and I want to make sure I record it, but I don't want to believe it yet. So that's the kind of catch-all literature note. So that's the ontology right now, and I think this basically maps to permanent nodes.
Which permanent nodes? The one in the book or the one that
all of them. All of them.
All of them.
Yeah, all of them.
Oh, they're always claims. It's true. Yep. So you're saying they're always claims, but
they're always your claims.
They're always my claims, yep. But they behave differently depending on what they're connected to.
Yeah.
Because it's like I can trace back what evidence or what other claims support this, then.
Yeah. So I might have some claims in my graph that are only suggested by proto claims, or they have nothing behind them at all. Right? They're just like my hypothesis or whatever. That's fine. But being able to trace back and distinguish between them is good, because like claims that have less support but are very compelling are research questions, right? I want to test them. I want to figure them out. Claims that have a ton of evidence behind them are building blocks. I can stand on them. I can say, okay, because X, Y, Z is true, then probably I can think of this new idea. Claims that have mixed evidence are very fruitful areas of inquiry as well, right? Because like there's something missing there, something interesting going on, and there's opportunity for progress. But Peter, you're absolutely right. Like the nature of the provenance is what determines how they operate as well.
And how do you handle the claims in, let's say, your lab environment, where a claim that you make based on certain things, you want to have a higher level, a different level, let's say, than those made by a very junior student, let's say, who doesn't have as good a sense of the field?
I don't know. I don't know that makes. I don't know that I want to solve that problem, because my vision is that each person has their own Zettelkasten. And then we might have a shared like discourse graph that we vote on and say, we're going to put these guys in there. And so there's some group process of consensus and collaboration that happens for producing a shared, stitched together Zettelkasten. Is my one hypothesis of how that could happen. But I feel like that's almost like a problem you don't want to solve, because I don't know. So in the lab environment, like our shared stuff is the evidence, so they can pull from the evidence for themselves. Evidence is pretty. It's not super personal, right? This is just like, this is a thing that we saw.
It's data. Evidence is basically data.
Exactly.
How do you deal with I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you deal with definitional things? So there's, for example, if I'm dealing with Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services, they define a long-term acute care facility, or there's a law that was just, it's arbitrary, but somebody made this decision, and that authority defines the way that everybody has to behave. Do those fall under, are those proto claims? Are those claims? Are those evidence?
Yeah, my heuristic is, if I can define some method of reproducing the thing, then it goes under evidence. And if I can't, if it's like somebody saying something, and I can't really reproduce it, and in principle, I can't define some repeatable way of generating that thing again, then I just put it under here. So it could be, so some definitions might have a like strong process of consensus behind it, right? They have a repeatable, like a Delphi process or whatever, right? They use some mechanism. They were careful to poll a bunch of experts. They had a series of input procedures, and then the output of that was this definition. I could see myself saying, yeah, that's evidence, because if I were to say, let me get in a different instance, let me get the same number of experts, same level of experts, use the same process. In principle, you would imagine that you'll come up with a similar thing or not, but it's like a generatable thing.
So the repeatability is the distinction between a claim and evidence.
For me, yeah. So like my heuristic is anything that shows up in the results section has a method that produced it, and so that's evidence. Anything that goes in the discussion is interpretation, and that goes under proto claims. That's the general heuristic I'm using and teaching to my students, and it works out okay so far. But yeah, the principle is like, if I can't write in the evidence note how I might try to get that evidence again, then I get very nervous and I say that's just a claim. Does that make sense?
So in the discourse graph, I think the most reasonable aim is collecting the evidence and proto claims part, because I think that's one of the biggest bottlenecks and I think sources of dread.
Yeah,
as of what I've seen.
Yeah, this is the vision is that, this can be your space. That's fine. Like I can like poke at this and see what you believe, but I'm never going to take it at face value. But what's useful is for us to have shared collections of this stuff instead of. So right now, everybody starts from here, right? From papers. Then they have to do all this work and then throw it away, basically. Like nobody else gets to benefit from it.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, but you can imagine like having a discourse graph that we can stitch together, we can traverse and say, oh, Isaac, you were interested in this too. Do you have any building blocks that I could use? I could get some of these, but I also could get some of these,
I think for the claims part, we can just probably leave it to peer review, assuming that, let's say, a discourse graph produces some kind of output or synthesis micropublication of some sorts that contains the claims.
Yeah.
And regarding the questions, I think they're like kind of bounties for the information foraging. So I think you can look that that question back to
Yeah.
sources, and that would be like collecting sources of some sort.
Yeah, this is the model right now, but the process is questions drive, and there's like some queue search. And so you have a gathering loop where you gather sources. And then you have a reading loop where you generate these evidence and proto claims associated with excerpts. And then based on these, you synthesize potentially individual claims. And then there's a higher order thing that is stitching together claims. Peter, in your structure, you have both of these, right? You have the observations or evidence that support a particular permanent node, right? And then also its relationships to other permanent nodes. So this is the synthesis process right here. But this is where like my students make contributions to my graph, right? We split the labor of reading the sources, extracting the gold, and then we can each take the gold and make our own stuff. But some of this will be collaborative. So there's a collaborative bit review going on right now for this question. And so there's a reading queue. Let's see if it's going to show up. Yeah. So there's a reading queue that we're splitting up a bunch of papers. And then as we read them, we generate kind of like, Peter, your processing thing. So we'll say reading this source for this question. This is the block. Now reading. Now reading. Actually, let me see. I'll show you a better one. This is the one I was discussing with my student yesterday. Right. So we're saying reading this source for this question. Under what conditions is it possible to transfer expertise from one person to another? That's broad. That's a big driving question that has its hands in a couple of different projects. So it's like rich enough to kind of drive, like we could imagine reusing this lit review across different projects. It's compelling. It generates projects, right? And then this stuff we fill in at the end. But first I collapse all the components of the tripod underneath here. So it's all intermingled, right? So I have like random stuff like discussing with this person, and then here's some methods information. I put in some snippets, and then talk about it. This is not done yet, so there's a to-do to refactor this so it looks more like this. Eventually, we'll extract the important evidence notes into their own page if we want to reuse them. And then we'll describe a summary at the top of the block of what we got out of this session. And then once we do that, then this goes into the queue. So these are ready, waiting to be integrated into the synthesis for this question. And the synthesis space, whoop, I don't want to do that. Looks like this. So in the early stages, we're just going to be dropping the evidence notes in here and making sense of them. Eventually, they are going to look a lot more structured, potentially like, let's see if we can open this. Stuck.
It looks like you've taken less defining of every step. When I do a question, I have every little piece. When I do a source, I have every little piece, but you've much more clearly defined what you want to take out of it. And, I want to get to this point. So sort of like everything becomes, if you will, a fleeting note, but you've defined much more clearly up front, what do we want to get out of it? And maybe that works better for a collaborative graph where you want to onboard people quickly and have different kinds of thought processes. And you focus on like, well, what do we want to get? And you have your way of thinking, I have my way of thinking, but I want an evidence note out of this. I want a synthesis out of this.
Yeah, it might. I'm gonna have some like question templates or some prompts, which I imagine might be useful in the early stages. Like, in my mind, it's very clear what an evidence note is, and there's a template for the evidence notes, which it's got a summary of what it is. I can show you right here. Summary, how to reproduce it, and what it's connected to, and then some metadata. But this is basically the methods, right? So how would I get this thing again? I would need to be in China. I need to be early in the pandemic. I need to use this kind of model and use this data. And then I might reproduce this result, but I might not. But at least in principle, this is how I would try to get this thing again. And then this is like, okay, self-cite by whatever. This informs this question. It supports this claim.
This works the best for empirical type work, I take it.
It definitely works a lot better for empirical type work. Yeah. So right now, the scope of the synthesis workflow is for lit reviews that have a heavy empirical component. And hopefully, if it works there, then I can figure out how to extend it to other situations.
So theory reviews. Oh gosh.
I mean, because like in general, the idea is like any knowledge claim that can be reproduced, right, with some method, some methodology, in principle can fit this, right? So this is like supposed to be general. So like if you had a proof, right, you've got the steps of the proof, right? And so that can go under here. You can summarize the lemma says X, and then here's how the proof goes. And I think that fits. A philosophical claim might say, I believe this one, and this is because of this thought experiment, and you can specify the thought experiment. That's fine. But the idea is like, how would I reproduce this particular?
I'm seeing evidence in hearing data.
Yeah, I think that's fine. So we can. That's how I'm thinking about it. That fundamental distinction between data and theory is correct. Yeah, that's how I think about it.
I would fit all of these things, and like I was rewatching Yulum, which showed this structure yesterday, and I was like, oh, I could just fit this under my literature notes. And the thing is, like, sometimes I might even just like block embed the summary, because from the same paper, I'm just getting different evidence, because like, oh, we came with 5 conclusions. So it's like, oh, I'm gonna make this 3, but I'm gonna split them in 3 different evidences because I need them in 3 different parts of my thesis or my project or whatever, because there are 3 different statements. If I can take value. So it's like in those things, and what you added there is just like, actually, it's like that increases even more the reproducibility of something. But it's not something I need to have, because it's not something I'm going to throw into a paper every time.
It's not something you need to have all for everything. Yeah, exactly.
But if I want to look back, because someone asks like, oh, do you remember this paper? Now, at the moment, I have to probably reread the paper. Not for everything, depending on the depth of the question. If they ask me the methodology for some of those papers, the one on refactoring, I remember out of memory. Some of them I wrote down what they did in terms of like, this is the methodology they use. But some I didn't bother for some reason. But like, this is like much more rigid and reproducible.
Yeah. The thing that I hope people also get is that it's meant to be not just for rigor, but for creativity, right? Because the idea is to give you a way to question what came before, and questioning what came before helps you to go beyond it, right? So you never just take things as like, we know that X is true. Well, do we really know that X is true? And that's not just to question it and be like a stickler, but also to say, what new questions can I ask, right? Where could this go? What new theories could I construct? Like, can I question that this assumption is not true, then maybe, maybe I can come up with a new theory.
This is one of my favorite books, and all down to to one sentence is like, creativity is not referenced work.
Yeah,
it's like I was just I'm solely just for fun. I'm not doing like out of spite or anything, but like I really like certain writers.
Yeah.
But I'm not a fantasy writer. I really like reading fantasy, but I'm noticing how lots of the things that everyone is saying, like, oh, this is never seen before. It's like, no, that was in a manga like 10 years before. It's just like nobody's gonna read. It's just like everything is kind of as long as you don't copy only from one person, you can get ingredients from different places, and that is still creative. But at the end, it's no ingredients that makes the recipe. It's also like the style that you add to it. So it's like, I'm not like their work is like, they got wonderful style and then a wonderful way to bring things together. But creativity is still in finding things that other people have done and bring them together in a different way.
And bringing things together is that's kind of the definition of synthesis. So
yeah. So there's I think this might still work. Everything is a remix.com. Or Everything is a Remix is a wonderful video series that gives that that basic point as well.
Joel,
Yeah.
quick question. Do you have any evidence notes that do not inform a question?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't. The reason is that it happens to be the case that I have enough questions in play right now that I'm always reading something with a question in mind. And so it's always informing something that I care about, or some wondering that I have. But yeah, so I was thinking about, like, in the early stages of inquiry, you don't have these directed questions yet. It's sort of bottom up exploring. I think in those instances, the Lebeau's Zettel workflow, I think, works better because it's not directed in a sense, right? It's the direction emerges from the reading. I think that's appropriate for like very earlier stages. I think that kind of comes into some of the discussions that were on Discord about like where Zettelkasten and synthesis fit together. In some sense, like the classical or RBC flavor of like very much against against top down, being very careful about being directed, wanting to leave as much openness as possible, wanting to be exploratory. I think is very appropriate for the early stages. And so in those instances, I could imagine like you read something and you see this result is super interesting and you don't know what it informs yet. I could imagine that happening. I just haven't experienced it because there's enough questions right now for me.
yeah, I'd be curious to ask like a second year student of yours, who this idea resonates with, but they're also reading for class, let's say, where it's not so research questions. How do you use it?
I would say if they're doing that, then they're doing it wrong. Like I tell all my students to be mercenaries in all their classes, like to approach only choose classes. I think this maybe works for my field more than others. But hopefully, if you take a PhD, at least even the core courses will relate to your interest in some way, right? And so you always want to approach all the reading seminars, whatever, with your lens and make that front and center. And so I would say if you're reading it and you're not even trying to connect it to some question that you have or some interest that you have, then I say that's fine, but please don't do that for the whole course. And if you're doing it for the whole course, I failed as an advisor because I should have stopped you from taking this course, right?
Maybe that just means I chose the wrong field.
I moved to information science because I used to be in psychology, and I went to the main cognitive psych conference, economics, and I couldn't get out of the hotel room because I was too bored. That's
Oh,
how I knew I was in the wrong field.
Yeah, well, I'm in industrial psychology and finished all my classwork, and I'm branching out more into shaping technology to fit human thought processes and collaborative processes, which is more like human factors, information science, human computer interaction. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah, you should come hang out.
Oh, sorry. My topic came out that way, so I remember. So I was not taking notes on it. I just remember that I just like once a week I just like to print a random paper I found as an interesting name and read it. Because why not? And I read this paper from a conference and from a workshop by Martin Fowler about the idea of refactoring. Engineering is incredible, like at least engineering, or the way I did it, had very little programming in it, so I didn't know what refactoring was, and I didn't know in a couple of months my supervisor would have left uni for personal reasons, so I would have to change my topic. So a couple of months later, I just remembered the paper and the concept, and I was sketching some stuff on the whiteboard in terms of that. I was kind of like, oh, these two things can fit together, and that's how my PhD works. It's just I read this, I was working already on CAD, and then I read this paper and that gave me a couple of ideas. It's kind of like, I can make this work here this way, and that's how it happened. But unless you are like very new to the topic and everyone around you hasn't give you a minimum of direction what you're doing, in research I find it incredibly hard to imagine a scenario in which you have evidence that then suddenly goes like, oh, I can inform something. But I think like that is what I liked. I think that would be the superpower to Zettelkasten in the long term. Once you have a certain amount of material inside, a certain amount of notes, what I expect to happen is you to see connections that you did not make, even maybe after 2 steps, 3 steps, in a way that you didn't see at the beginning. And then that's why you need to start, you start looking for research, and you start asking questions and answering questions that you didn't think you could ask at the beginning. And that you didn't not, and they were not asked because there were no evidence or observation in themselves.
Yeah. In some sense, maybe also like I don't have an index. I don't do the Zettelkasten proper because, in a sense, base usage of Rome's primitives is in some sense already a Zettelkasten, in that your blocks, at least some of them, are meant to be reusable, and so they're connected, and so you have this kind of network. It's not full on, right? It's not Lumen Zettelkasten, but it has some of the properties of it in that you're able to traverse through a graph of atomic ideas. And so one of the purposes of that would be to find serendipitous connections. And I do experience that, even though I do not have like a central index that's optimized, right? I can traverse the graph that way. Maybe it's not the most optimized, but I get some of that value of like seeing connections. Like I just today, I managed to pull up a video from Mike Caulfield and describing federation from June 2020, because I was traversing this idea of federation again today. It came up again today, and in that sense, it's Zettelkasten-like, right? You find these connections that are not based on categories.
But in the traditional sense of index, you do have an index. Your whole graph is your index. It just has other stuff in between, and you know where things are because you're organized in a certain way. It's not everything in a certain page. And even for people that keep everything in a certain page, once you reach a certain number of blocks in the page, you need to split things up. Otherwise, it's just like pages too big. They just slow down everything.
Yeah. So my question pages are my index as well. My outlines are my index. My project pages are my index. They serve the purpose of entry points.
And the point of the index was never to resurface your fleeting notes, and those are the ones that, in a way, Rome has over the original Zettelkasten. But all your permanent notes are linked to research questions, to projects, and in a sense, like that is an index.
Yeah. So again, like Peter, it comes back to your point about like the fundamental principles and building blocks, and then implementation might look different, right? Maybe you don't have a permanent notes slip box, but you do have, you know, various indices that you can, like Victor used the, was it you that, no, someone else uses like, so in Obsidian they have maps of content, that concept, which is very similar to the concept of an index, right? You have like an index, a structure node or an index node basically, where like refactoring, and then that'll be your entry point into the most important question, most important permanent nodes, whatever, literature note sources, and that's your entry point into the area. That's your dashboard, and you develop it over time. Like it's not meant to be a static thing. And so
yeah, and I've looked into those maps of content. I still can't quite figure out what the difference is between a map of content and the structure node, but
it's
I'm
the
working
same thing
on
to
it.
me. It's the same thing.
Yeah, to me, I keep looking. I'm like, I just don't see the differentiation. You're calling it something else.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same function.
Yeah, so just like I like to have clear definitions for everything,
yeah,
I don't like having synonyms. When you're trying to set something up.
Yeah, I mean synonyms are, I think, very important for the optimization step, right? Finding something that resonates with you, I think is important. But the problem comes when you then say, this is how it should be named for everybody else. So having like a translation glossary of some kind.
Yeah, but translations can be very local. Like for example, one of the things that you called like your some of your projects, and I may be misstating you, so please correct me, but you call them bets.
I call them bets.
And so I actually like that terminology. In fact, I called my little thing the research casino, because I said this is so I like that terminology. And then you were talking about question notes, and I said some of these questions are like the Zettel questions, as you would end up being sort of like what's the areas of responsibility. These are things where you're trying to move the the topic in a particular direction.
Yeah, it doesn't really get answered in your lifetime. There's no like well-defined way to know when it's done. If it is, then it's a smaller question, right? Yeah.
So I'm trying to solve the problem of finding a research topic. So for my thesis, undergrad thesis.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I have an idea on how I can integrate the evidence note thing that you have, Joel, to the structure of Bow, but I have not yet tested it. So can I demo it, like the mechanics only and not really?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I believe it. I'm designing it to be modular enough that I wouldn't be surprised if I'm actually going to try to prototype what it looks like to integrate it with Le Beau Zettel.
Yeah, Le Beau Zettel. Why can't I?
It's the first time you said that term without laughing. You know that.
Yeah, I think we should take it seriously. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
So what I'm thinking is, let's say,
that's basically what you do, Peter, right? Your evidence is generated from some stuff.
But I think I want to separate the evidence notes from my Zettelkasten
index.
No, like from the permanent notes page. So
yeah.
So what I'm thinking is I'm reading a paper. So I process it, then I get some evidence notes out of it.
Yep.
So it lives here. But then I would create a link reference to the daily page. But then this fleeting notes attached to it.
Yeah.
Then what I'm thinking is, so there's also an evidence note here following the structure. And this is I think this is the most shareable form
Yes.
of this thing.
Yep.
Then I would, since I have no idea what it is informing, I would let them collect and cluster over here into an evidence notes page.
Why did you pick that paper to read though?
No, this is just an example.
Okay, but like yeah, so that'll be my sense of I'm having trouble imagining a situation where you would, unless someone would force you to read some random paper, there probably would be some curiosities in your head. But I guess if it's not super well defined, that's fine. Yeah.
What I'm thinking is question notes and observation notes are kind of like the open loops in GTD. So they're like a triggers to what I've said is the information foraging thing.
Oh, I got you. Yeah, yeah.
So you could, so in an ideal world, you would have a discourse graph to go to instead of trying to go into the wilderness known as Google Scholar and library databases.
Yes, the wilderness.
And what's that? Basically, the traditional way of quote unquote researching.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
So I think that's all from me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
The only thing I check because I like the summary. What was it? Summary method and
yeah. Discourse.
Yeah. So it's, in this context, the place I'm gonna put them is under, you know, where you put like your observation and your fleeting notes.
Yep.
I'm gonna put under there.
Yeah.
Under my literature notes for me or your observation for you. It's like I'm just gonna put it under there because then I can still have the level of navigation that I have and I can keep the page clear. So I basically maintain everything under the tripod. It just goes under the tripod.
Yeah,
because
I think it fits under the tripod. Yeah,
it's just a better way to is an even better way to structure a certain type of papers, structure the literature notes, because then when I look at it, I even less need to look at the paper again because it's so well presented.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because the other thing that I'm trying to do is I'm optimizing for shareability. Right, because like this is for me and my students and my collaborators. I like to be able to like, I have many different projects where I've got students and faculty from different universities and labs, and I like to be able to say, oh, this thing is happening, let me point you to these evidence, and I want to be able to share self-contained things, right? So that's why I put in the work too. But I think it makes sense, like that's the function, right? Indenting it under the evidence note, I think it's the same basic function for myself. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Can I ask you a question? So what is the advantage you get from linking a question to the putting a question under the evidence you looked for? So like, I know I want to put my evidence under the question until I answer, because basically I'm just piling information that I looked, and then when I look at it, it's kind of like, oh, now.
Oh, you mean inside the body of the evidence note?
So why do you do that other way around? Why do you have evidence? When you start writing your evidence, why do you always go like, oh, for querying stuff? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. So I'm working with David Vargas on prototyping a synthesis plugin that hopefully will do some of that in the background, right? So like there's having that inform attribute is kind of a part of the semantics of the discourse graph, like formal graph. And I would like to be able to expose a querying interface that's a lot more user-friendly, that's optimized for synthesis. So you can ask questions like, I want to find all the evidence for a given question, or I want to find all the evidence that opposes this particular claim, or whatever. That requires some structuring that is different from structuring it for navigation. So that's the idea behind having those blocks. They're tedious, so I don't want to do them manually. The only value they have is downstream for query. So I would like to not have to do that manually. I like to be able to implicitly specify, right? If I put this evidence note inside a question, then by definition it informs that question. And I like to be able to have that relationship be queryable somehow in a formal graph querying way. But that's the idea behind those connections.
I guess there is the oh, sorry.
I'm branching off a little bit, so if you're still on this, continue.
It's just very quick. I guess it's like there is the added value what you were saying about students just reading stuff for evaluating. It's like because you're forced to write like what question motivates you reading this, it makes you have a mental check. Because like, do I really need to read this, or is there anything else?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's like you're actually it's a way to make sure everyone has a purpose.
Yeah, I mean,
in what they're reading.
The particular now reading block structure is scoped to a direct, like a lit review process where there is some question. And if you want to do like free form reading, you will probably just reference whatever questions came out in the feeding notes, I think, right? Like you say, this reminds me of this other thing that I'm interested in. You wouldn't be forced to have that be like the purpose of picking up this paper, because sometimes you just gotta sign it.
I guess the purpose can force some sort of confirmation bias. It's either like if you read something with a specific question always in mind, then you are going to find the answer, which is what like Sonke says in his book, like bad students are very good at finding sources to support their questions very quickly.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. So
the danger is that
very explicitly say it could be that this source doesn't inform that question and would like to say that. Right, they'll pick this up with this question in mind and say, well, actually this is a crap study and tells me nothing, and let me explain why. And that's great for us to like not go back to this in the future. And yeah, so the other thing is that I never think about papers as read or not read, right? Because they're always read with a particular lens. And so it makes reading a bit more fun for me. So it's like more mercenary. So I'm not like, I don't have to read a paper cover to cover. Like if I do a inspectional read of a paper and say, okay, I don't need to care about experiments 1, 2, and 5 for now. Only experiment 4 informs this question I care about right now. So I don't have to put in 2 hours to read the whole thing cover to cover. I'm just focusing on this nugget that might help me for this question. And then at a later time, I might pick this paper up again and say, now I'm interested in how this informs this other question. Then I'll focus on experiments 1 and 2. And so that's like it works for science reading. I wouldn't do it for personal pleasure at all.
Does that change the way you take literature notes, knowing that, if I have a note on something already, then I'm less likely to come back to it?
What do you mean?
Does it, if I've read a paper, if I go to my thing and I'm like, oh, have I read this paper and I have notes on it, I'm less likely to pick up the paper again to, for that reading, even if I should. And so I'm curious, do you have a different process of taking notes or recording your literature notes to influence your future self to be more likely to pick up the paper again when you need to, or are you just more disciplined than me? I'm not being clear, apparently.
No, I think I understand your question, but I don't resonate with the problem of not picking up a paper, because I have the opposite problem, because papers are always like fun to pick up, and so I need to have a reason to not pick it up as opposed to pick it up.
Okay.
But we do try to leave like trails for the future, like why might I want to pick this up again. But hopefully you wouldn't have to pick it up to verify for this particular question again as you needed to.
I am curious, Joel, because you're using your idea of integrating multiple knowledge graphs, if you will, is very unique, where it's like it's for this data, for the evidence pieces. And I know when Connor has spoken about it, he had it in a different context. He was more like, well, I'm looking at who's an economist that I trust, and I should pull his stuff into my graph as like I'm relying on him for knowledge. And I'm curious if they're aware of this other use, which I think is also important, so that as they are thinking about integrating graphs, they're aware of this other type of use.
I thought that this thing I'm talking about was what was specified in the original Rome white paper. much more so than the I just want to pull stuff from other people's graphs. But I think that having the claims and evidence as a mediating mechanism could lead to really important things. Like, I'm not just going to take you at face value, but I can at least see the work. And you could explain to me better by showing me things if I'm motivated enough. And so then it increases my understanding. I'm not just parroting what you say. It's not that I distrust you, but you can explain to me better and say, hey, look at this graph. And I can say, okay, well, this is the reason why I think that it's true.
Context being key to communication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you build a methodology to make an argument in a structured way that you can repeat and people can clearly understand. Because every time you are faced with someone that looks at your structure and says, this doesn't quite click, you either know that there is either missing information or your structure is not strong enough.
Yeah. And I'm especially excited for situations where you have like two experts that disagree. And then we are able to go back to the evidence and say, oh, okay, you're looking at slightly different evidence, and here are some critical experiments. Maybe this is something else here are now 3 new experiment ideas that we can run to help resolve this dispute. Be able to look into, because right now there's tons of open arguments where experts disagree, right? Do the vaccines work for the variants enough, or they do not? Should we open school? Should we not? Do are children more susceptible to COVID than we think, or are they not? Do masks work, or do they not? And then you are always able to find sufficient numbers of experts on either side of a debate. And then how do you resolve that? Without the ability to go into on what basis are they making those claims, it kind of devolves to me into basically heuristics and popularity contests, or like, I agree, I trust this expert more because he agrees with what I believe. I like them to be able to duke it out on saying, okay, what evidence do you have? What evidence do you have? Okay, these are the same, these are different. Let's figure it out and have that be the substantive like argumentation, as opposed to like, I've got 10 experts and you've got 8. And 6 of your experts are only early career researchers, so I trust my group more.
Yeah, I think that the thought I would have on that assessment, when you have differing opinions based on the evidence, also has to do with values. And I don't know how you capture values. I mean, I can imagine kind of putting it somewhere, but there's no clear one place to put the values and how those values are implementing the synthesis. In other words, for example, using your example, opening schools with COVID-19, right? It may be a value judgment and not an evidence judgment.
I think
so. I can tell you, I know it is actually, but the point I'm trying to make is that it could be one person values this economic impact, more, and saying like, so what are we trying to optimize? Right now I'm trying to minimize. So you're minimizing economic impact versus optimizing the number of lives that are saved. So those are different fundamental things, and so I don't know how that system can capture those things unless you're implicitly, unless you have to kind of infer the values, because often they're not stated. So I guess that's
no, I agree. I think the value of having an explicit system also is to show what's not there, right? So if you have 2 groups of experts and you say, well, the evidence is unclear, well, then on what's left? Then we can be honest about the fact that there's differences in values, and we can talk about that instead of saying, I have the science behind me, or I have the science behind me. No, well, the science is, admits both points of view. Well, then what are the other things that we bring into play to argue for or against this position? Okay, let's be honest about values. My system is not meant to capture that, but hopefully it helps to make clear that is going on, right? I
think the system, in order to be robust for different fields, it has to be able to capture that, because there are some fields where those values are the field. You know, in other words, like that is the, you know, that is the I mean, there's certainly certain philosophical, ethical, you know, you know, so you know, so when you start getting into like ethical arguments or philosophical arguments or even economic arguments, you know, which is a much more empirical field, you know, understanding what things are being valued, then you start having an argument about what should be valued. And those what should be valued is an intrinsic part of the synthesis of thought that is happening. You cannot parse that. You cannot divide that easily, you know, without robbing the argument that's being made of its heart, as it were. You know, there's and its perspective and its lens. So you might be having, you know, there are many, in fact, some of the most fascinating books that I've ever read are precisely about the way that the lens that you look at something changes your perspective. And it's that very lens that gives that book that depth and that richness. And so being able to capture that somehow, I believe is important. I don't know that it's easy, and I don't know that it's vital for certain empirical fields, but I think that it does allow that ideal nuance in thought, or that additional nuance in thought, I think can be valuable and important. And I think that ideally the system would capture it, either as an inferred value or an explicit value.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I started doing some reading with a plan of maybe in a year, 2 years, have some notes regarding history and philosophy that I could try to wrangle in terms of something like that. And the topic that I had in mind, because of political and current reason, for example, I asked recommendation to Calistory and other people on books about Middle Eastern politics and Palestine-Israel conflict. And just reading through that, it's just very hard to find authors that tell you like what they in their book, even in a book, they just don't start saying like, this is what I believe in. So you cannot ground everything you're going to read in the book. You need to do further research about like who wrote this and anything. But being able to encapsulate that in a single, or even that in the note, having what the book or the extract of the book is saying, and then having somewhere something that relates to the author, have a leg of a tripod that says this is the beliefs that this has been built on, and allows maybe to, when you bring this all of these notes together, able to take in consideration those values you're talking about. But I feel like I'm just doing a little bit of reading on things that are very much out of my field now. So maybe in a year and a couple of years, I'll have a few notes to play with and be like, okay, this person believed this for this reason.
This is interesting because that was this idea of encapsulating, I think of it as context, like part of the context of knowledge production, right? Like where people are coming from, that may not be as clean as like experimental evidence. And I do capture that, but it's not now in my explicit model. Right? So like I have a block under each paper page where I write context, like context notes, like, I don't know, this is who the author is. When they wrote this, they were still figuring things out, or you know, this paper was late in the development of this idea, so it's fairly mature, and they're pretty prominent, and so you might want to keep that into account. And then having the authorship relationships helps me also say, okay, this is coming out of the Northwestern school of thinking about analogy, which is different from the UCLA connectionist stream of thought. And so having that, I have a place for that, but it's not right now explicitly in the model. And that's the kind of thing that you also take into account when you synthesize, right? Yeah. there's not a note type right now, because the tough thing about context for me is that it could be anything, you know. So, but something about where the author is coming from makes a lot of sense. In qualitative work, they actually now have a best practice where in the method section they will say that they call it like a standpoint declaration, right? They'll say, this is who I am, this is what my lens that I'm bringing to this particular field study. I'm an outsider, or like I have no experience in cat and I'm studying cat people. They do declare these things, and they might have values as well they declare. And so that would go under my grounding context, right? Because in the sense, like, how would I arrive at this same claim? Knowing something about the standpoint is part of the way that I would try to retrace the steps to get there again. But that doesn't feel like it gets at what you're saying too.
It starts. I mean,
Yeah,
in the sense, in other words, it's a beginning in the sense that, you know, sometimes, you know, saying like, these are the arguments, you know, for example, I think that at some point, I think it was Peter, he was talking about the different things that he uses to structure his argument. Like, what is the evidence that's being presented? Having something under there that you could have a very specific kind of, you know, additional note that you have to support a particular argument for synthesis. Observation note, I think, is a term that he may have used, or but whatever that is that, you know, having something in there, or a category where you say like, this is the driving, you know, premise, or the driving lens, as it were, with which these facts are being focused. And because often it's that lens that's going to actually provide the, you know, the tree on which you're going to hang all these different arguments, you know. So I think that's anyway, I think that there is that, the idea of having the standing or your perspective or whatever. I think have that idea, when you said it, I said, oh, that's something you could do. You could just put there, you know, what you and you can actually differentiate inferred, explicitly stated, you know, inferred, explicit, you know. This is the value that's being expressed by the author, and it can be in a very technical field as well. I mean, I can definitely say in medicine,
in philosophy, you have like or even in quantum physics, right? You have the Copenhagen interpretation and the whatever else.
Yeah, they have different interpretation, and in medicine, it happens very explicitly as well, in terms of they're saying like, you know, if we are interested in controlling the cost of healthcare moving forward, this is the, you know, because of these facts, you know, this is the idea that, you know, this is the argument that I'm making, right? And the other person might say like, if we're interested in, you know, in making healthcare a human right, these are the arguments that, you know, that support. And so you have, you know, these can be very solid, empirically supported arguments. But, you know, but stating what, you know, either implicitly or explicitly stating what that lens and where this comes from, I think is useful.
That falls under. So what you're saying is also important in what Joel was saying initially, having two experts coming together and talking about something. That the context of who they are, and most importantly, the thing that we didn't say, who's paying their studies, can give the additional information to be like, oh, this is where they were coming from. Because the moment you only have, you're stripped of it's like the moment I encountered on the ground in which they can only present evidence and talk about it, and just put evidence and no trying to discredit it. It's like having a debate without trying to trying to distract people with other aspects of the credibility of the person, but actually concentrating on the information you're providing. But having the context where when they looked, who looked for the information and with what purpose, that can also give either a different weight to the person that's making the argument, or a different weight to the source of the evidence where the argument comes from. And I don't know, it wasn't like a few months ago that was coming out, like there were lots of articles about sugar research from Harvard that was paid by certain companies, and it didn't quite portray. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's like something along those lines. When you go like someone that sells I don't know,
Yeah.
someone that sells banana asks you to make a banana research, says how bananas are good for sight. And it's kind of like, yeah, we can draw a graph that does tell you that they're good, but we're not gonna say what other like what other vegetable is better, because we're not gonna put it in there. It's like you can always do that.
Yeah. There's like a couple other connections, like in math. Turns out there's this thing called ghost theorems, like these axioms that everybody knows in the inside of a field, but they never explicitly say. And if you don't know them, it's very difficult to reproduce a particular theorem. So these are like almost like where you're coming from, like your that are not always explicit. What set of shared axioms you have, and then a couple other examples of why knowing who makes a lot of sense. Like if Peter proposed a theory and has won a Nobel Prize for it, and I am testing that theory with an experiment, that means something different than Peter's student testing Peter's Nobel Prize winning theory. Like there's a bit of a different stakes there. Similarly, if Peter's student publishes a paper that refutes Peter's theory, I take it more seriously than, a little bit more seriously than Peter's rival publishing a paper that refutes his theory. And that's really tricky to, a lot of that's like very tacit knowledge that you have from being in the field. But it's nevertheless super important for understanding.
But that goes back to property, what I said about property. It's like the advantage of property is like you get recognition for what you've done. And there's like, and I feel like people should, like, if they've done really good work, there's no reason why they shouldn't be recognized for it. It's like it motivates people to do better. But at the same time, attaching, like by doing so, you need to attach an idea to a person, which it creates the problem of people believing an idea because they like or not like a certain person, or as you said, the credibility of someone is given based on the relationship to someone else that is prominent in a certain field. And there is extents to which that could be reasonable. For example, if my father, was a doctor, was a physician, tells me something about engineering, I'm gonna double check it, because I know that that's just, how did you know that bridges follow this? Because it's kind of like, wait a second. But if it tells me something about medicine, usually I try a face value, and that's because it's got a degree. And it's so it's like, where do you draw the line? It's like that becomes another issue.
Yeah.
So what I'm kind of observing is that we cannot escape the fleeting notes, I guess.
I think so. Yeah, the natural place for this is the fleeting notes, right? And so I think for the individual case, this is not a problem. There is a place for it, right? Because if it's your personal notes, you can say, I think I don't trust Joel because I've seen 2 papers of his that got retracted, and I didn't like the way he answered questions at this one conference, and so I can like put that stuff in my personal notes, and that's fine. I think what we're maybe a bit more problematic is how might you represent that in a collective or shared discourse graph. There's not a place for something like that in the ontology, and that's problematic. I think like it diminishes its usefulness if there's not a way for that to be shared as well. But I think you're right. Like in the personal case, it's not a problem. There's places for it.
Fleeting is everything else. It's like it's conversations, thoughts, observation, ideas, questions. Until a question you ground it, you elevate it to the big Q question. It's just fleeting. Everything that's just there because it hasn't everything that you would normally put in an inbox, but you want to contextualize there, you just put it in the fleeting aspect of it. That is in the nature, is in the definition of the word, it's fleeting.
Yeah.
And then
but it's accessible to you though. It's
Yeah, it's
accessible,
accessible
to you.
to you.
Yeah.
And you can make a decision during
Yep.
your review, whether
Yeah.
it's your annual progress review as a student or like your
Yep.
weekly, monthly, you can make a decision. It's like, actually, this specific
Yeah.
fleeting thought I had,
Yep.
I want to elevate it and give it a
Mhm.
higher importance.
Yeah. So that's my point, right? Like, you, Peter, and whoever else uses the Zettel structure, right? You have a way to. There's a place for things that maybe you didn't want to write down as an attribute yet, but you wanted to note it down. And then maybe later when you're synthesizing, let's say there's 10 different evidence notes, 6 of them point one way, 4 of them point the other way, and you're starting to dig deeper, you can go back into the tripod underneath the evidence note and note, that one time when I was reading this up, I looked up the author and found out that even though it wasn't in the paper, they got a lot of their funding from X. And so maybe that informs how I synthesize and end up coming one way or the other for the 6 versus 4. There's a place for that.
So if I were to find an article that supports that statement, I might put it under literature. But if it's just a thought I have, I put it under #FN, which is for my fleeting notes quickly through through anywhere in my graph, or under fleeting notes when I'm making structure. My idea is that that kind of tag is high enough, but not too deep down, that if I were to want to say, like, okay, if you don't look at my interstitial journal stuff regarding how I was feeling while I was doing something, but you just look at my work. If I were to filter out throughout all my graph, #FN, and after fleeting notes, you should only see everything grounded on evidence, or like something that is referencing evidence here and there.
Hey, this is awesome. This is it's also really late for Wilbert.
I gotta go.
Isaac. Yeah, me too.
Are we gonna do this again?
We should definitely do this again. Yeah, I'm not sure what the cadence would be, but we should do it more than once a year. Definitely more than once a semester. But we'll figure it out. There's a lot to talk about. I want to see how the system evolves too, and I'll have more to show. And hopefully down the line, like, I would love for any of you to be. I like to revisit that standards work idea. Also, like speccing out like a protocol for collaborative, whatever we're gonna call it, Zettelkasten.
Yeah, reach out to me if you'd like, and I'm happy to participate.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much for organizing this.
Bye. Thanks.
This was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks everybody. Good night.
It was
Good
finally
afternoon. Good
put
evening.
some faces to typed words, and I'm also happy to be like a auditory, like I process things auditorily better than anything else. Like, it was nice to have this kind of discussion and everything. So thank you.
Yeah, awesome. All right, talk to you all soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.